It will take nothing short of 100 proof living to restore lives. Join a conversation between a cop and a criminal with Brian Yates and Chris Pridmore, working to inspire and motivate others, rebuilding the communication breakdown. This is the 100 Proof Living Podcast.
Well, welcome back to Conversations with a Cop and a Criminal. I am Brian Yates.
And I'm Chris Pridmore. And today we're going to talk about hypocrisy and the masks we wear. And, you know, Brian, this is something you've been particularly passionate about as we've developed this show. And I just wanted to, I guess, turn that right over to you and get us off on a good note here, because I know you've been pretty pumped up, fired up, and motivated about this one.
Yeah, this is probably going to be a little bit of a Brian ramble. So give me a little bit of latitude here. I want to talk a little bit about the definition of it and talk about some aspects, but this is a real passion of mine because it's been such a stumbling block for me personally. And I think this was one of those big aha moments in my life when I looked in that mirror, and I don't know if it was probably someone holding it up saying, you need to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Sorry.
Always 80s rap.
But it's something that, and it continues to mean more to me every day. And I've got this kind of echoing thought in my mind that makes this a stronger conviction for me, as well as a bigger motivation. So I'll get to that in a little bit, but let's kind of start out as we usually do, wordsmithing this a little bit. So hypocrisy is the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. So real quick again, the practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. So the way I describe this is, if we have these beliefs in our mind, we've come to conclusions, we've developed this worldview, that's our head, right? And then we also have our heart, which is our passions and our emotions, and, you know, I'm sure there's psychobabble out there to describe these much better than I'm doing. But that's our heart, right, and our connectedness and our feelings. But then there's also our behaviors, the things that we do, and I'm going to call that, you know, the hands. So it's head, heart, hands. And when those things are aligned, we are being true to ourselves. We are in alignment. And a lot of times what I started to see was that I was not really being true to my beliefs. And let me back up just one more step. So, I recognize, so let me not lose the audience in this area. I'm going to talk specifically about an area of faith, which might not resonate with you, but stay with me because this has crept out into every area of my life. But there's an author, a speaker, a pastor. His name is Francis Chan. Chris, you've heard me talk about him a ton.
Yep, he's really good.
The first time I ever really listened to him, he gave this great analogy, and it kind of shocked me to the core, because it was like a second he said it, like this veil was lifted, and I kind of saw myself for the hypocrite that I was. And so what he did is he kind of holds the Bible up in his hand, and he says, if you grew up on an island and all you had was this Bible, and you learned through that what it was like to be a Christ follower and what the church was supposed to look like, and then you came to the U.S., do you think you'd be able to reconcile the difference between the way a Christ follower, in air quotes, Christ follower in the U.S. and the church in the U.S. acts? And his point was no, in many ways. And then he listed several scriptures that we tend to dismiss. And it just kind of wrecked me, because I've been a believer in the Bible, in God, in Jesus, all of my life. I was just raised in the church, and that was just part of my worldview and just something that I kind of assumed. But what I realized was that being a Christ follower was not very consistent with my behavior. So there was that misalignment, and that's where we get into this this part of hypocrisy. So now, to end my rant, let me tell you this echoing thing that goes through my mind over and over. And this is where I think we can bring the entire audience, faith-based or not faith-based, struggling, not struggling, doing well, whatever. listen to this, and I can't get this out of my head, so I'm hoping to poison the rest of you with some of this. But
this better not be an annoying commercial.
Yeah, well, and it's not even from 80s rap, so it might actually resonate with people.
You're growing.
Okay, so if you knew you were going to die tomorrow, what would you do today? And the next question with 3 bold, giant question marks behind it is, why aren't you doing that today? And that just keeps echoing. Is it I would run and mend ways with a broken relationship, or I would go share my faith passionately because I knew it was my last opportunity to do it, or I would go right some wrongs, or I'm not talking necessarily about a bucket list of jumping out of an airplane.
Right.
But what are those things? How would you live life differently if you knew it was coming to an end soon? And then why aren't we doing that right now? Because to me, in my life, that's where I'm a huge hypocrite. Like, I could still answer the same question today if I knew I was going to die tomorrow. And there are things that I know passionately I'd want to do that I'm probably not going to do today. And so I struggle with this on an ongoing basis. And that's why it's such a big deal to me.
Right. And I tell you, it's what you're saying does strike home to me, because really the questions that you're asking of our audience are essentially saying, I would be shocked if one of our audience members, I know I wouldn't do this now knowing what I know now. My last day, I wouldn't be getting in an argument with somebody about politics. I wouldn't, necessarily be standing in front of a church arguing about some, version of a hymnal. Any number of these arguments we get into and put this code on other people that we say and that we've got hypocrisy behind our voice. But I mean, what would you do today? And why aren't you doing it now? Really points the reflection on the actual heart of the matter. What do you actually believe, and are you aligning your behavior with that? Right. To me, it strikes home to, you can't align your behavior to anything, and I see this in recovery as well. If I'm relying on a treatment provider, I'm relying on a recovery coach, a counselor, a family member, a loved one of any kind for my recovery, it's not going to happen. Change happens when you look towards yourself and make some decisions. You make some promises and you keep some promises.
Absolutely. And where you and I have really kind of strengthened our relationship is that ability to, sometimes it's hold up a stop sign for the other person. And
right.
That stop sign should serve as a mirror, right? And that can, you've talked about it before, that can be true in the addiction community. It can be true at work. It can be true in families. As we started pulling this stuff together, you really hit on an area that I think we should chew on in front of others. And that's the business side of this. Right. When you talk about the, professional hypocrisy from, people that take moral standards, but then, it becomes acceptable to just lose your mind at company drinking outings.
Right. And this is definitely where you and I were both getting fired up. We sound like Randy, was it Macho Man, Randy Savage, the wrestler, getting all crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, because, and I've picked on this in other episodes, the sport coat wearer. But, there is a ton of hypocrisy around that because, you mentioned, I think for me at least, I have a bias when somebody says hypocrisy. Immediately I think church and religion. I think about, a minister doing something inappropriate, but yet standing in front of the pulpit and telling his flock to do something completely different, those types of things. But where I've been particularly aggravated, but I had to go back to my own solution about pointing to, my own behaviors, is in the business environment and how we behave with each other in that place. And, I spent 25 years in the healthcare sales environment, sales and marketing environment, and every year they'd have national sales meetings. And they would pour alcohol in those meetings. I mean, just right. Healthcare organizations dumping alcohol by far and away in excess of anything that would be recommended for casual use day after day after day for a week. And all kinds of poor decision-making, career-limiting moves, they call them, would happen at these events, but yet they'd still sponsor these drinking events. But yet outwardly, if somebody has a struggle in their own personal life, if you are the 1 in 12 in our society right now that struggles with alcohol, it's a big no-no to own that. And God forbid you actually get yourself in some kind of legal problems on the outside, your career is done. But yet, if you were at their sales meetings, you would drink far and away more than you do at home. Or let's just touch on the infidelity piece. There's this code of 300-mile rule that people joke about. If you're 300 miles away from your spouse, all of a sudden you've got a free pass. Never bought into it, but these jokes that go on, and it's this double standard. But yet, on a website somewhere, they'll claim this wonderful face to the community. And the
Right.
challenge is then, so what do I do with that? Do I look at the excuse of that? We do have to look at ourselves. What's our role in it? We participate in it. I was at those meetings drinking just as much as everybody else. So it's a little bit hypocritical for me to say, okay, they can't do that, but I'm sitting there drinking along with them.
Well, and this is, again, another one of those intersections for learning to appreciate people, because there is this idea, like you talked about, and I've seen it firsthand, where people will go out and at a sales meeting or a conference, and get absolutely hammered, come in the next morning and even openly acknowledge, man, there's no way I should have driven last night, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and they kind of laugh it off, and have a little hair of the dog that bit you, and go right back into it the next day. And, but let's just say there's 10 of those people that kind of randomly get together from work, and they just, they overdrink. When one of them get a DUI, boom, they're out of the club. Because now there's that stigma. Yeah, absolutely. I know it's impacted you, but you see this, and this is so this is where we get into this idea of we have to kind of make a choice on how we interact with others, because, I don't want my worst action in my life to be, how people remember me or how people see me from that one worst moment. And so then I can't then do that to someone else. But let's move a little bit into where I think this is really helpful for people in terms of kind of personal development and getting to that raw, kind of brutal honesty with yourself. We've talked before about how there's this kind of differentiation within hypocrisy. There's kind of overt and intentional hypocrisy, right? There's the double life. There's the person that might show up to an AA meeting and be hiding what they're actually doing. So they're choosing to hide things. But then I think, going back to the head, heart, hands model, I think a lot of us are unintentional hypocrites. Like, we wouldn't wake up in the morning and be mindful of the things we're going to try to do that go against the grain of our beliefs today. But we end up doing some of them. And so I think if we can, start to move toward some practical steps for people, because it could be your marriage or your children or your professional life or your spiritual life, or a weight loss journey or a sobriety journey. You have these things, your head, you are rock solid in your thoughts. You know that if you follow this program, you're going to get these results. And so you just take, I can use a diet as an example. I know I want to lose 10 pounds. I've done the research, or I've gone through a phase before where I've proven to myself what it takes to lose 10 pounds. So I know without question what I need to be doing today to work toward that goal. That's my vivid reality when I wake up in the morning, right? But then my heart, or maybe my stomach, pulls that behavior out of alignment, right? And I'm going to shovel the first cupcake I can get my hands on down because I'm hungry. Now my head, my heart are not aligned, and so my behavior goes way out of whack. And so for the unintentional hypocrisy in our lives, what are some areas where you've learned, whether it's, I know you always talk about journaling, but just throughout the day, or even maybe even longer term things that you can talk about that will help, that have helped you, Chris, that have helped you keep your head, heart, and hands aligned toward your beliefs.
The example you just gave actually really does, and this is not a tactic, but it does come back to realistic understanding of others, getting outside your own head, so to speak. So you use an example of somebody struggling with a weight problem. If I were a person struggling with weight, I may relate to somebody else that's struggling with weight and their hurt and their pain. But I might have a notion that says if you're struggling with addiction, you're somewhat less of a human being. Or not. I would never want to admit that, but right. I may behave that way. It goes back to your initial premise that we claim a standard, but our behavior doesn't substantiate that. And so my weight problem I might even take my own weakness and put it on a higher plane than your weakness, and not relate to you. And where I found victory in my life is when I came to an absolute understanding that we all have broken places. So my own hypocrisy, I absolutely was the hypocrite that would sit at one end of the bar and say, I'm not a drunk like that guy. And where'd that get me? Worse than him.
Yeah.
because I didn't recognize my own weaknesses. I didn't see where my own failures. I didn't see my own crumbling foundation. I just sat there jumping up and down in the house until the foundation collapsed. Where things change is that when I recognize that we all have, as individuals, we have struggles. You talk about value, you talk about making mistakes and stuff like that, but the fact is we do all have struggles. That's why the show is even here. It's not a show about addiction. It's about how do we overcome life's hurdles and challenges. And this is one area. To get over that and to get beyond and do the next stage, we don't do it by saying my affliction isn't as bad as yours, so you're somehow lower than me, and that's just pride. The honesty piece. So for me, my honesty with myself is most important. So the tactic that I've used is to just really have some true self-reflection. And you and I talked earlier about this, and I think this was a huge point for us to kind of get to this level, is that when we do this show, or you talk about anything, including a show like Hypocrisy, where we could very easily become hypocrites talking about hypocrisy, even though neither one of us knew how to spell it going into the show.
I've got it spelled 4 different ways on my notes.
I'm not surprised. The last one was in that big fat crayon.
Yeah,
but
right.
Our challenge is that we don't want to come in and say, in anything in life, you can't come in and say you're the expert. I'm king of everything. At the same time, don't come in and say, oh, woe is me. I'm defeated by this, because there's no value. You can't relate on that level. Where I feel like victory of hypocrisy comes in is a realistic expectation that you have to be 100% of who you are, where you're at. It goes back to your water bottle thing. You might not be as good as somebody in some area. You might be having bigger struggles in some area than somebody else. But be authentic. Be exactly who you are, and understand that others also have struggles as well. It takes the pride layer out, which is really, I think, what clouds our vision in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's been so true for me. The people that have helped me the most in this area, or professionally, in other areas, is where I saw that authenticity, and it was a lot of times it was just them being real about them. It's, if you think of like the different infomercials for exercise, it's not the guy that gets up there and says, look at me, you can be just like me. It's the guy that says, I struggled, and here's how I got to where I wanted to be. And then it allowed me to take that same kind of mentality and say, okay, maybe I can apply that process to get to where I want to be, which may be similar to that person, or it might be very different. But instead of just holding up this gold standard, it's going along the path that I think God put me on, and doing it to the best that I can do based on the things I'm equipped with and the resources that I have, whether that's relationships or whatever. So I think for the someone that might be struggling with weight loss or sobriety or whatever else, I'm gonna throw it in early. I'm not perfect. Nobody is. And that speaks to your idea that everyone has this brokenness. Everybody has challenges. And I love the language that, Paul uses in Scripture, where he says, I don't do the things I want to do, and I do the things I don't want to do. I mean, that's right. That's the definition of hypocrisy, but he's saying this is my struggle. And it's whether it's a faith issue or a dietary or sobriety issue, we all struggle with this idea of being misaligned with our real beliefs.
When you said that, it reminded me of the word I used earlier with you, and that is, it's baffling. I think for me, where I've gained some sensitivity towards others and their struggle along the line, and I certainly wouldn't say this was the case all the way. I found that I was actually more opposed to other people's weaknesses when I was actually really struggling with alcohol addiction. But the idea of baffling, I've learned people that are struggling the most when they're so baffled by their own struggle. They want so much for better days, but they just can't figure it out. I have a heart for those individuals, because I know they want to know the answer, and they recognize they don't have the answers. To me, that's the start of victory. It's a start of a new day. When you know you don't have the answers, and your focus is not on somebody else giving you the answer. It's not on somebody else's affliction. It's on your own absolute astonishment over the situation you're in, and you want to strive for more. You want to strive to improve. When my heart was humbled to that place and broken to that place, if you will, if you use that terminology, I found it virtually impossible to place judgment on other people. I was upset about not having an opportunity back in my old career. I still am in some respects, and I have to keep myself in check all the line because I look at them saying, you're kidding me? I know you guys have drinking problems. I know the stats, blah, 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 and you still won't give me an opportunity to even have an interview? Are you kidding me? Well, those things I have to be real careful about keeping in line because it is a violation of what I say to be true. My job and my purpose has become clearly defined in my life, and that is to be here and to be available and to plant seeds of hope in people that are ready to receive it. And that doesn't mean I have to go out and dump my story down somebody's throat. But I do have to recognize that my journey was baffling, and theirs might be baffling for them too. And sometimes they just need me to hold their hand to make their best available next decision. And
yeah, I think right there, but what you said there is they have to be willing. And so there's this, maybe for some people, planting the seeds of hope is one thing, but I also think there's some of the things we've covered before is planting those seeds of motivation, right? Getting that kind of inspiration to start inertia and get the thoughts going so that there can be, instead of more just, status quo, which is not going well, right? If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And this idea of having a better way of doing it, maybe some of the things that we say, and I know that that's your real passion when you're meeting with people in their worst moments, is to give them some of that inspiration to, hey, you don't need to be here again next week. You can be somewhere else much better. Mm-hmm. And a year from now, look at the two trajectories. You keep doing what you've been doing, and things might be over for you.
Right.
But if you try it a new way, you can actually be on that upward trajectory of recovery of health and recovery of emotions and, so many positive things. There's a cost to doing it. Sometimes people hit that. We got to count the cost of what it's going to take, and then they shut down. And so that's when they need the hand holding. They need someone to shoulder up next to them and say, no, you can get this. You don't have to, you're not going to boil the ocean. Right? You're just going to do one small step at a time. And it's like, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. And so it's coming alongside people, and for all of us to be willing to do that for someone else, and also be willing, that's the other part of this, being available, being teachable.
Yep.
And that requires humility. That's one of the things I've always thought you do a tremendous job of is you will pause and think. You will take in information from people because I think you have that that vivid reality of maybe I can learn something from this person because I was kind of closed off to listening before.
Yeah, I had a tough lesson in learning how to shut my mouth and listen, but I had that example actually happen today, truthfully, and I'll try to connect. If I feel like if I'm getting sidetracked, Brian, just be honest with me like you normally do in conversations, because I'm going to try to connect two different things here that happened today, and I think they make sense. So I met with a CEO of a recovery organization today, and I see addiction in particular right now. This environment that we're in is innovation rich. And what I mean by that is while there's so much desperation in it, those that are innovative and can find a way to help in different ways will get a different result. That's true in any business environment, and I believe that's true in addiction as well. One of the things I get frustrated with is when I see stagnant behavior and doing things the same old way. And so these are the two thoughts. So there was this conversation going on. And as we're preparing for the show, I was reminding myself of a presentation I did a while back at a church, and I talked to them. It was something I had seen on some video or some inspirational video. And basically what this support leader did is he took a picture of a mask, and he showed it to the group of people, and he handed these pictures of this mask out. It was like the Hamburglar mask, but it was just line drawn on the paper. It was on a white piece of paper, and he had them all write on the mask side of the paper what they were projecting to other people, what they were trying to project in the way they dressed in the morning and the conversations they were having, what look do they want other people to see about them. Then he asked them to write on the white side what actually was going on in their head. All the feelings of emotions, fear, worry, all this stuff, anything you could think of. He asked them to just be truthful about it and put it on there. Don't put their name on it. Fold up the piece of paper and put it in a basket. Then randomly go up and grab one. They'd open this up, and the outside was like, I'm cool, I'm an athlete. On the other side, I'm full of fear, anxious. I'm worried about my dad coming home drunk. I'm worried about my mom, leaving. These types of things. So the reason I present that is because the masks that we put on in front of people aren't necessarily what's going on, and that can be true about everybody. So back to the situation with this conversation. I went in because at that level, there's certain masks that you have to put on. I also went in with a certain, I would consider, hypocritical perception of this person's vision for the organization, how things were seen and being led. And then with connecting through a conversation, I saw that the other side of her mask was actually somebody that recognizes that she's a perfectionist and that she wants things done the right way. And she has a heart for human beings and their well-being. And the reason that things aren't changing as much is because she wants to do it the right way all the time for a patient. And to me, I could connect with her on that level. But the mask and my perception and my hypocrisy would have never gotten there had I not had a face-to-face conversation with her that allowed for both of us to disclose the white side of that sheet of paper, what we both felt about situations. And she was gracious enough to hear mine too. To me, hypocrisy, preparing for a show about hypocrisy, was alive and well in a conversation that I had at 9 o'clock this morning. So we can talk about it all we want, but it's a rigorous effort of honesty. We have to understand that we always do this. And to your point, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. In this case, it certainly wasn't, but that behavior was still existed.
Yeah. Well, let's not overlook the fact that sometimes, whether it's self-preservation or, I believe that parachutes work, but I might not go skydiving for fear of consequences of it not working.
For the record, I do not believe they work.
So that could be a misalignment. There could be some things, and sometimes, like you said, you go into maybe a professional setting, and maybe you didn't show up wearing flip-flops, Jordan shorts, and a tank top, like you might normally be wearing.
That's cool.
We put on masks. We put on an image sometimes to conform to certain environments, and so not suggesting that every time we are not 100% ourselves, or that somehow perfection with our beliefs is the goal. It's this idea that if you find yourself angry, if you find yourself in a lot of conflict, things aren't going well. If you find yourself with a lot of hopelessness, things aren't going well. And here's a great place to start, because starting that true honesty with yourself and recognizing maybe where you're missing the mark, recognizing where you're not being true to yourself. If you have certain beliefs in your, road to sobriety or your professional life or your walk of faith or your family life, connections with other people, even the whole time that Alex and I were, we spent years compiling all of that material for learning to appreciate people, I was still having bad interactions with people because I was not appreciating them. I still do. So it's not an idea of perfection. It's just of being aware. We can do better kind of thing. And if you find that, you have this anger, you have this hopelessness, then things aren't going well. So let that be kind of a huge opportunity to do things differently. And I think that this idea of looking for authenticity in yourself before you look for it in other people, because other people are going to disappoint you. I'm going to disappoint you, Yep. But to be authentic with yourself so that at the end of the day, you stood for what you believe in. And to me, that's a huge victory for people that have so much in their life they can't control, to be able to start taking control of your own behavior and, being authentic, having your head, heart, and your hands all aligned as much as possible, and being willing to assess and admit when they're not, and then work on it.
This idea of hypocrisy, I draw from my kids a lot on things, but I've mentioned in other shows, hypocritical behavior really is changing me. I'm doing some kind of an effort when I'm being hypocritical with somebody else. I'm being hypocritical to keep them there as I understand them, to keep them at a level I need them to stay at, and ultimately I'm the one that's changing my life around what I believe them to be, and I have to conform to the system that I've set up, the hierarchy. But my daughter taught me something the other day. She went through a very hurtful experience with a friend that my solution to her was write that friend off later. I was pretty aggressive about it. And then a couple of days later, she was like, yeah, I'm pretty upset. A couple of days later, she comes to me and goes, so how'd this work out with your friend? And she said to me, she goes, she came to me and asked me for forgiveness. And I said, my coaching to her was like, oh, wow, that took a lot out of her. I go, what'd you say to her? I'm thinking, okay, my daughter's going to get it with this girl. You know what I mean? And she just goes, I forgave her. And I was just stunned. I go, you did what? And she said, because, and this was the lesson for me and the hypocrisy on my end, the lesson for me that my 15-year-old daughter educated me on that. She goes, it's much easier for me to forgive her than to deal with carrying the grudge. Mm. And to me, that was a great example of, she recognized that, she could hold that grudge. It would change her behavior. And she stayed true to her belief system that forgiveness was important. And I'm 47 years old and she's 15. And I said, at some point we changed parental roles in this little situation. I'm not sure what happened here.
Which isn't surprising because you are kind of a 14-year-old.
Yeah, okay, whatever. But speaking of value, you have your, I think we're at a point now where, the idea that we've been unpacking here for a few weeks is the necessity of addressing hypocrisy in our own lives. We had to see it. We have to see it and recognize that when we're judging other people that way and behaving that way, something has to give, and it has to start with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of the things that we've talked about, at least on these episodes, from stigma and, a vivid reality and self-esteem and, even some of the practical things of journaling, it all starts with us. And I think sometimes our outward negative behavior is driven by sometimes a broken self-esteem that we're breaking ourselves. We're damaging our own image of ourselves because we know we're either not being self-confident enough to stand for our values or strong enough to continue to follow through on the things that we know to be true that we should be doing. That idea of doing what we don't want to do and not doing what we want to do. Right. And it does. It takes some self-esteem. It takes some self-discipline. And I cannot wait to launch this into ownership because I think that so much of what we've talked about really comes down to that ownership. And
Agreed.
When we jump in that pool, it's deep and it can be really muddy. But that's where in my life the blame for other people, the excuses, that stuff all kind of fades away when you start diving into this brutal honesty and really understand what taking ownership can do, and the freedom and the relief that can bring.
Right. Hypocrisy and ownership cannot coexist, I don't believe. And so for us to identify the hypocrisy in our life, stripping that out, we can dive into understanding not to rent our lives. These decisions we make, as baffling as they are, we still have to take ownership over it and figure it out.
Yeah. Well, I tried to throw it in there earlier, but as we kind of wrap up, I want to come back to this idea, and I can't say it enough. It's been super helpful to me to just keep repeating this to myself, because sometimes I need it as a mirror to see myself, and other times I need it as a lens to see others. But I'm not perfect. Nobody is. I have value. Everybody does.
Yeah, and wrapping up this show, make sure you check us out on Instagram on 100 Proof Living, and then we also have a Facebook page of 100 Proof Living. Until our next show, enjoy 100 Proof Living and nothing less.